Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a very special episode for you where we'll show you how to take the brand new DjinnBass from DI to completely world-class mix-ready tone in a couple of minutes. Now, for those of you who don't know what the DjinnBass is, the DjinnBass is a virtual bass instrument. It is a sample bass that you can program in the performance using the MIDI piano roll. And it's perfect for demoing, pre-production, possibly even final record use if you're not that comfortable with recording or mixing a bass guitar. Now, for those of you who already know what the DjinnBass is, you might be wondering, well, it already comes with two completely pre-processed tones, why do we need to know how to process it ourselves? Well, the reason for that is the way that processing affects samples versus the way it affects a contiguous performance. So the way that compressor envelopes and distortions are going to affect your performance for your song are going to be different to the way that they affect individual samples as printed in the instrument. So if you consider yourself mid-level, higher, professional, you probably want to learn how to actually mix the DI sound into the final product. And this is what this video aims to show. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy and have fun. Alright, so here we are in the session. This is how everything boots up. We've got our pre-prepared MIDI track going into DjinnBass already, which you can hear like this. So the default way that DjinnBass boots up is pretty much perfect. It's just giving us the raw DI output out of the instrument. The only thing you may want to actually alter at this point is the sound of the muting noise, which is the sound of the fret and the string grab after a passage of music. So it's basically that rhythmic mute that you naturally get from grabbing the strings. So just adjust this to where it sounds good for your resulting tone. Now, if you're curious about how to actually program the MIDI, we have a great tutorial up for this done by our good friend Simon Sandnes, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name there, I'm sure I did. I'll put that up in the corner for you guys now and down in the description below as well. So that should definitely help you out if you don't know how to program the MIDI in the first place. For all those of us that do, we'll move on from here and I'll start showing you how to actually process the resulting DI tone. So the very first thing you want to do is actually export the output of DjinnBass out of Kontakt onto an audio track and re-import that into your session. Because this is different for every DAW, I won't cover the process here, but it should be fairly straightforward if you have any elementary knowledge with the DAW that you're using. So what we want to do with the resulting track, as you can see here, I've got the DI track on a channel. You want to take that track and you want to duplicate it 2 times, right? So 3 resulting tracks and you want to name them accordingly. So we've got the DjinnBass DI, we've got the DjinnBass Parallax, minus the group, and the DjinnBass B7K minus the group. So what these are going to represent is the 3 facets of our tone. The DI is going to be strictly the low end and low mid portion of the sound, whereas the Parallax and the B7K, or the Dark Glass Ultra rather, are going to constitute the grit, the mid-range and the top end of our tone. We're going to reconstitute these together on a group track, which we'll process together for the bulk of the tone. But I'll show you guys how to get as much tonal flexibility getting to that point as humanly possible. So for starters, we'll go to the DI track and just take a listen. Alright, so that's the raw DI coming out of DjinnBass. Now, the bridge section in this song is a really good place to use for this because we have to dial in our main compressor. So the easiest way to do this is on a section that's generally up-tempo and contains a lot of note variety from high to low, which this section does. Goes very low, goes very high as well. So let's listen and see how we can dial our compressor. As you can see, I have this largely pre-dialed from before. The key is to essentially, with DjinnBass, be hitting the yellow on the loudest passages. Because the samples have been recorded so consistently, and I made sure of this myself because I did it, you don't have to use that much compression. So if you're hovering somewhere between 5 and 7 for the majority of the playing, that's pretty good. Now for me, in terms of attack settings for the main bass compressor, I tend to like having it around about 3 to 4 ms, maybe 3 to 5 ms. That allows a bit of the initial transient attack through, so you're not stifling the tone completely at this point. However, you're also not leaving it sort of unruly and wild. With the release, generally, I've got it about 65 here, which correlates well with the distressor settings I use in real life, but you can jog this anywhere up to about, let's say, 120 for general purpose use. It all depends on the tempo of the music that's being played. So this controls a lot of how the notes pop in and out of the performance, and you have to kind of jog them for your specific song. For me personally, I like 4:1 or 3:1 ratios. I've been progressively liking more 3:1 as I get older. I think it's because I find 4:1 can often sound a bit stifled and pinned, and while that can work in context of a mix, I find 3 gives you a lot more leeway to process down the track. So cool, this is our processed DI track. Hovering around that nice 6 point on the low notes, pretty good. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we instantiate a linear phase low pass filter. Now I'm going to show you what this does. Alright, so the reason that we do this is we only want the low and the low mid content out of the DI track. It doesn't have very much flavor, it just has a consistent bottom, that sub content that we want to maintain throughout the mix. And the reason that we use DI without a cab sim or anything is because the cab sim will invariably introduce peak resonances due to the microphone, the room, the speaker combination. These aren't things you want to be dealing with. For ultimate low-end clarity and punch, we want to maintain the DI as the low end. Now, we move on to our Parallax track. I'm sure you can guess what we're going to throw on here. Alright, so I've tweaked my Epheid preset that comes with the Parallax for this. There are a few things that matter here and a few things that matter a little bit less. Because I've already dialed it in, I'm going to talk you guys through what I've done to get to this point. The low compression part doesn't really matter all that much. If you want to be in a safe spot, you can keep it at about 0.6 compression and the level down at like -19. But because we're not using the low end portion of this signal for the resulting tone, it doesn't really matter that much. What we're more focused on is the mid distortion and the high distortion, and maybe some of the EQ settings as well. So taking a listen to this. The Parallax is intrinsically a very, very distorted unit, just by virtue of how it sounds. So you're not going to get away from that gnarly sort of a thing. So it's a good unit to use, and just embrace that quality of it. Just go with it. You can see that no matter how far down I turn things, it's still gnarly and still quite heavy sounding. So we'll embrace that, and in this case, the mid drive is going to be 0.38. The high drive is going to be 0.3, high pass at 1370 Hertz. Now, this you can jog around to get a thinner or a thicker sound, just really depending on the scope of what you want. Find that about 1.3K is round about where you get that sort of apocalyptic tractor thing going on, so that's the right place for me. What I've also done is I've dipped back 1.5K and also the top end, because that gets super gnarly with this bass. If the slider was here, I would actually dip down 2 kilohertz on this bass, but unfortunately we don't have that in Parallax, so this is what it is. Alright, so moving on to the next track, or actually, before we move on to the next track, we show you how to filter this. We're essentially doing the inverse of what we did with the DjinnBass DI track. We're actually instantiating a linear phase high pass filter, and we're filtering up at about 295 Hertz and listening to it with the DI now. So you can start hearing how this is going to come together in the end now. The reason that we use a linear phase filter specifically is because the way the two filters between the DI and the parallax track interact, they will cause phase cancellations if you use minimum phase filters. So this is one of those few times when you actually really want to be using linear phase to maintain phase coherence and to maintain the integrity of the bass sound. I personally prefer the 18 dB per octave filters for this, but you can use the 24s or the 12s or whatever you want. I would suggest not going too shallow because more overlap between frequencies in this case is really not what you want. And before I forget, in the cab section, the parallax, we're just using default settings for the sake of simplicity. Feel free to play around with a combination of different microphones to work out the tone to your personal preference. I believe with the Dark Glass Ultra, we're doing much the same, just using the one microphone, the 906, at the position 0.35, which is a little bit closer to the tweeter than you would otherwise have. So, moving on to the Dark Glass Ultra track. Alright, so you can see here I've already got this thing preset, and I'll talk through why I have these particular settings going on. This is very easy to do, and this is only an auxiliary distortion track. The reason that we're using this is to basically just alter the texture a little bit of the parallax, give us a more unique expression to fill in the empty gaps and to create a more rounded full sound. So blend is cranked all the way up, level to taste depending on what you're shooting for. The grunt setting is in the middle. Drive is around about 2 o'clock. Now, one thing I would suggest doing is when you're doing this yourself and trying to gauge it for the parallax sound, I would listen to both together. So what we can do is we'll filter both. So we're just listening to the top end. We're just trying to get a sound that's complementary to the parallax. If we put the drive too high, we lose all the clarity. The distortion just blends with the distortion from the parallax, and we end up getting none of that sort of clean fret clank that we so like. Now, with the EQ controls, these aren't so important. Again, we're rejecting all the bass with the filters, so keeping that at noon is completely fine. The lower mids we have set to 250 Hz in this case, which is where a lot of the muck of this bass guitar lies, and we've taken it down to about 9 o'clock. So you can hear why it really clears up the tone, just makes it a hell of a lot more brutal. High mids is essentially the gnarly fret noise slider, which on a dingwall bass can be super dangerous, but at the same time super exciting. So we've got it dialed up to about 2 o'clock, and we're going to go from there. As you can hear, the treble doesn't add all that much useful stuff for us in this context, so keeping it at about 1 o'clock is fine. Again, with this plugin, one of the things you generally find is that the sweet spot settings are just past noon, or just below noon most of the time. It doesn't necessarily need the most extreme settings to sound extreme, because it already is so extreme intrinsically. Okay, so now we've got our resulting tone, which is this. Bear in mind the shape of this tone can be controlled quite a bit with the filters that you've got going on. If you want more lower mid-range from the Dark Glass Ultra or the Parallax, you can pull this filter back and then bring those in, or bring in more from the DI or less from the DI. It's where you basically get the overall shape of the sound. You have a tremendous amount of flexibility here. However, it's not going to get you all the way, because bass guitars are they're so intrinsically full of junk in their inherent sounds that you really need to work with them in a broader sense, or in a much more microscopic sense, in order to get things right. So what we're going to do now is pull up an EQ that I've pre-cooked for you. Now we're going to talk about what this does and why it does it. Listening to it by itself, you may think that me turning it on sounds a little bit more, I guess, unimpressive, maybe a little bit more flat, but this makes sense in context of the mix. So the reason that we've kind of, let's say, tamed this tone down is because there are other instruments taking up the rest of the frequency range. We can't take up everything with the bass. We can't leave all the sub content in there. We can't leave all the crazy, gnarly high mid content in there as well, especially because you would have vocals in most mixes. So I'm going to talk you guys through what we've done here and why we've done it. So the very first thing that we've done is a filter at 63.953 hertz with a fairly aggressive Q that's really rejecting a lot of that sort of 70 to 80 hertz stuff. The reason for this is that the bass in question in 3 pickup mode has an exceptional amount of low end and sub low exertion to it. Not all of that is intrinsically usable. It's very impressive sounding when you're playing it by itself, but in context of an entire mix, it's not necessarily something that you want to be hearing. So the next thing is 73.255 hertz. This is a very classic cut that we put in place to actually let our kick drum poke through. So if we listen to the drums and this in tandem, so you can hear when I kick in the EQ, it gains so much more of a prominent mid snarl and then lets the kick do more of its own thing, right? That's the whole point about this. That's the whole principle behind mixing, is to let everything have its own space. So moving on from here, we've got a very, very common cut that we do on basses to de-ring them, as it were, at about 165 hertz, which I'll show you now. So as you can hear, it sort of clears up that mid-bass range and it kind of allows the drums to do their own thing, and there isn't this ring overbearing the entire mix. Now, your mileage here may vary. I know some people like having a lot more of this in the mix than I do, and there's nothing wrong with keeping more of it in there so long as it works in context with what you're doing. The 250 hertz cut, as we were talking about on the Dark Glass Ultra track, is pretty much the center point for getting rid of mud in the vast majority of bass instruments. So let's take a listen to that. So you can tell when I drop the cut back, it gains a bit of a lower mid snarl, which is a very cool thing, and you can keep that in there as much as you would like. A lot of this is rejected by our filters before we get to this point, but just bear in mind that it's another area that you want to zero in on, and you can see in this case I've done a 4.5 dB cut. Now from here we've got a cut to the quote-unquote flat mids at 615 hertz at about 2.7 dB. As you can hear, this is what that does. So it makes the bass tone thinner yet more dimensional and more aggressive at the same time. It's more of that smiley face VEQ kind of thing. Again, your mileage may vary, you may prefer different sounds, but this is a useful frequency range to bear in mind. Now this next one is super self-evident and super important. On this type of bass, with these types of strings and these types of distortion processes, 2K is always going to be a bit of a problem zone for you. That's ultimately where all the clarity lies, but at the same time, it's where all the obstruction and peaks and craziness lies too. So what we've done here is actually put in a different shape bell filter. So instead of 12 dB per octave, we've got a 24 dB per octave. And the reason we're using that is it's able to grab more of the range that we want without affecting the surrounding tonality. And that's something that's very important in this case. Experiment around and see what works for you. Now, moving on from here, all of this stuff is contextual, so obviously it's going to work for you if you're using DjinnBass in these exact processes, but the reason I want to say this is most basses have a lot of weird non-linearity kind of peaks and nodes and craziness happening up in the upper mids. That's one of their renowned problem areas, and in this particular case, those problem areas are about 2.7, 3.4K, and 4.3K, and I'll show you what they all sound like as we jog them up and down. Right, so all of this stuff is essentially just a byproduct of years of doing this. You'll eventually be able to see and hear these particular nodes as soon as you pull up a tone. It's something that just sort of comes with time, but for the sake of this example, you can pretty much just copy these cuts, and of course the cut severity can depend on what kind of tone that you're personally chasing. But beyond that, just bear in mind that this is a renowned problem area for bass, and don't feel like you're overdoing it by getting this notchy. It's just something that bass guitars very often need, so, you know, we do whatever we need to. Now, the very last move that we have going on is a low-pass filter at 7.15K, and I'll show you because this is a very obvious sound. Without the drums. So interestingly, you can hear that the effect is a lot more obvious when the bass is soloed, and you know why that is? It's because the cymbals take care of that range. The 8K and up is cymbal territory and vocal layer territory, which is why we don't want the bass up there. So the illusion of having the cymbals up there fills in that impression that the bass has this extended top end without actually clashing with the cymbals. I mean, these are mixed fundaments 101, but hopefully it helps make you aware of why we do these sorts of things. Now, moving on from here, you can see I've got an instance of Soothe up here, which we're not going to use for this, but if you do have a plugin like Soothe, what you'd want to do is set it up for the peak resonance up in the high mid, somewhere about 2K or 3K, depending on where's giving you issues, and set it so it's barely working, down at like -36. It's a tool like this should be barely heard. The vast majority of your processing should be done manually with EQ. It's always more elegant and always sounds better. Now, from here, we're going to do our last stage of bus compression and bring the tone together. We've got an instance of 1176 style FET compression. The attack is just before noon. Ratio is 4:1 and release is maxed out, which means it's at its quickest possible setting. What you want to be doing is ensuring that this, at its highest operation, is not exceeding about 2 dB. So as you can see, it's dialed in pretty much perfectly for this. And the role of this compressor is to round out the sound a little bit more because FETs have a very nice saturation quality to them. But at the same time, what we're doing is we're taking care of those errant peaks because their attack envelope character is so extremely fast that it's effectively functioning as a limiter as well. So let's take a listen to this in the context of the entire mix. So, in order to put the final piece of polish onto our resulting bass sound, we're going to do something a little bit stranger. We'll be sending the DjinnBass group to a high-pass chorus, a stereo chorus, and what's going to happen there is that that's going to spread just the high pass grit sound, the mids and the highs, across the stereo field. And this is very, very cool because it gives the bass a wider presence that glues more with the guitar track. So I tend to use fluid. You can use whatever stereo chorus you like, and I'll show you very quickly what that sounds like. So you can tell that it's a very cool effect, but it can very easily become overbearing. So long as you're sparing with it, you can merge the bass with the guitars in a little more visceral way and hopefully get a better resulting bass tone. Now, for those of you who don't have a lot of time or interest in this sort of thing or are just plain lazy, well, we've got a solution for you. If you load up DjinnBass and simply click on the amplifier, switch to the boosted channel, or heck, even use the orange one, just hit the play button. I spent a very, very long time pre-mixing the preamped sounds in the DjinnBass to be effectively 90% mix ready for you. So if you don't have the time, or you're just demoing and you just want to get your songs out as fast as humanly possible, you literally have it at the flick of a switch. Well, I hope that was educational. If you have any comments or questions, don't be afraid to leave them below. In the meantime, consider subscribing to the channel. We have a ton of new mix tutorials coming all the time, and we'd love to have you on board for the trip. So until next time, see you.